But it's a debate that people have thought about throughout history, especially when it came time for going door to door in World War II, during World War II, during the Holocaust. Do you have Jews in your house? What do you say? When you talk about like smuggling Bibles into places where they're not allowed to have the scriptures, what do you say when, even today, like when terrible things are happening where people are going door to door? It's a really interesting ethical and moral question that's dealt with in that passage. But we're told explicitly in Hebrews chapter 11 that she acted in faith and that she acted righteously. And so, I think there's an interesting phrase that we sometimes say. We say that what we see through the Bible is that God draws straight lines with crooked sticks. We are those crooked sticks. We all have things in our lives that are to differing degrees. We've sinned in action, we've sinned in inaction. We have, it's not just what we've done, but it's even who we are at our core.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us this week once again. And guess what? We're in a new series, beginning in the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, however you want to say that. And not only that, but it is the first week of our Advent here and the Advent series. And it just kind of came together that we're looking at the book of Matthew as well. And Behold Your King is the title of the series. And this week, as we dived into the first half of the first 6 verses, which is the kind of half of the genealogy that we find in chapter 1, the title of the message was The King's Credentials. And so if you missed any of that, whitefieldschurch.com, get over there and you can download it. You can listen online. You can stream it. And also we have an app. And if you download the app, you get notified when we go live, and you can also access any of the archives or any of that, and any of you get push notifications about anything that's happening here at the church as well, and get those coming to your phone, and of course Facebook, YouTube, any of your favorite streaming platforms and podcast apps as well. And if you have a question, you like this content, thumbs up, rate and review, any of that stuff, any way that you interact with the content just kind of boosts us up in the ratings. And so when people are asking about genealogies, which is a big thing these days, it's going to show up on the top of the list there, and we're going to be able to provide Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to their questions. And so topic of the week, of course, is genealogies, and people, of course, love genealogies. And I would say that probably was, true of a few years ago, maybe a decade or so ago, that, people come to genealogies and they think about the word genealogy, they're like, that's boring. Why would I want to do that? But of course, we've kind of had an uptick in people wanting to know where they came from. Am I Italian? Am I Ukrainian? Am I Scottish? Am I Irish? French? Or am I, whatever, Peruvian? Where did I come from? And, that's kind of something that people are like really diving into. And so you kind of dove into that this week. And that's kind of the whole point of this particular genealogy is giving credentials to who Jesus was. And so we just wanted to kind of dive into that because in Matthew chapter 1, we have one genealogy, but then Luke chapter 3, we have another genealogy, and both of them are of Jesus. And so we want to kind of look at the differences. Why are they different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so some people, they've been kind of weirded out by that. I think that there are no scholars out there who have a problem with it, and the reason is because the answer for the difference between the genealogies is quite simple, though it may not be apparent, just at the first look at it. There's certainly a lot of interesting things that you can dive into, which we are doing and we will do in this next Sunday as well. But the main reason is this. Matthew's gospel traces Jesus' family lineage, Abraham, David to Jesus, and it traces it what we might call through the legal line of succession, whereas Luke's gospel traces Jesus' family line according to the physical genealogy. Now, both of them end up at the same conclusion. that Jesus is the descendant of Abraham and the descendant of descendant of David, which is the key thing is the descendant of David part. We already know that David's a descendant of Abraham, so that's not a big surprise there. If Jesus is a descendant of David, then he is also a descendant of Abraham. But there's a really interesting thing, which we'll get into this next study. I'll have some more details for you on it. But in Jeremiah chapter 22, there was a curse put upon this guy named, is it Jokinadab? I think he's in verse 12 of Matthew 1. And so there's this blood curse put on him.
Jeconiah.
Jeconiah, right. So he gets this curse put on him, and the curse says in Jeremiah 22 that none of his children will ever sit on the throne of Israel. Now what happens, and without getting into all the legalities and all these things, but what happens in this case is that the legal family line doesn't depart from there. It just goes down a notch to the next person in that family line. And so it's carried on through him, even though he didn't have a son who would sit on the throne. And then in Luke's gospel, we again have the family line that Jesus is a part of. And there it follows the physical line, but it's both of them end up with Jesus as the descendant of King David. What's important in Matthew's gospel is that he's not just the descendant of King David, but he's the descendant according to the family line that traces through the legal aspect. So that's why there's a difference. There is actually no difference in those two genealogies up until David. It's after David that it changes. And the reason for that, of course, is because of this guy. What'd you say his name was?
Jeconiah.
Yeah, Jeconiah, that's right. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit this Sunday. It is interesting how it all works out, but it is also just one more proof of the fact that Jesus not only is a descendant of King David physically, but he's also the descendant of the royal line legally. That's really the point. And that is the focus of Matthew's gospel. Matthew focuses on Jesus' kingship more than any other gospel. He uses the phrase kingdom of heaven more than any other gospel. It is his main focus. And one of the things that's unique about Matthew's gospel is that it is focused especially on the Old Testament. So he uses more references from the Old Testament, quotes more from the Old Testament than any of the other gospels. He's intentionally showing this continuity. That's the word I'm looking for. He's looking for this continuity between the Old Testament and the prophecies and Jesus. So, that's an important thing for us to understand. It's something we always emphasize here at this church, that the whole Bible is a book about Jesus. And that means that the Old Testament and the New Testament are not at odds with one another. They're very much part of the same story.
Yeah. That's the idea, that legal idea, and of course that is the title of Behold Your King. And Matthew is very much about the kingdom of God and the fact that God has still to do business with Israel, and that business is being done in the person of Jesus Christ. And it was just thinking about going back to genealogies. People have watched the show The Crown. Why are genealogies important? Well, nobody gets to sit on the throne of England unless they are part of a certain line, like the Windsor family, and that is traced back, and that's kind of why these things are so important. But if you watch The Crown, you know that there are a lot of things that they kind of covered over, black sheep, or as I think you did a study, knots in the family tree. And we see here that there are some people that, while in the Windsor family, they stuck them away in mental institutions, or, changed their names, or kind of, things got burned up and magically disappeared. Here in this particular genealogy, we see that God is embracing the knots in the family tree, like in Rahab and a Tamar. I think you touched on Tamar, but a bit on Sunday. But what about Rahab? Let's just talk about her for a bit.
Yeah, so 5 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. 3 of them are Gentiles. 3 of them committed adultery. Three of them had bad reputations. I mean, you can go on. These are the stories that most people, maybe they have them in their family, but they don't emphasize them. They don't talk about them when you ask about their family. They don't say, oh, and there was this lady named Tamar who did this super messed up thing. Rahab is a really interesting case because Rahab does a few things, like she lies, for example, to protect the spies. So the story of Rahab, by the way, it's found in Joshua chapter 2. And what's happening there in Joshua chapter 2 is that the people of Israel, they have traveled through the 40 years, or rather 38 and some change, coming through the wilderness on the east side of the Jordan River, what's present-day Jordan. And then they enter into the promised land. They cross at this place called Gilgal. And then once they get into Gilgal, they're not far from Jericho, but Gilgal becomes their first homestead, if you will, in the promised land on the west side of the Jordan River. They cross over, they set up at Gilgal, and then from there, they attack Jericho. Now, Jericho is a fortified city, very difficult to get into, and so they come in and they stay at this inn, which is run by a woman named Rahab. Now, some people have said, well, why do you presume that Rahab was a prostitute? Okay, number one, it's because she ran this inn, and in those days, that's just how inns worked, but that's not the only reason. The really kind of slam dunk evidence is that in Hebrews chapter 11, it calls her Rahab the harlot, right? So she was a prostitute and engaged in that, and yet she met these men who came over as spies to check out Jericho, and she also hid them. And she lied to the people of Jericho, the authorities, when they came to look for her, or look for those men. She hid them and then, covered for them. And apparently, though, Rahab didn't just stop there. She goes on and becomes a believer, like a full-fledged believer. She doesn't die in the conquest of Jericho. She's spared. And she goes on to be included in Hebrews chapter 11, where it says that by faith, she hid the spies when they went to take over Jericho. But for a lot of people, that brings up some interesting things. I mean, was it a righteous action, an action of faith, to lie and to hide these people? The other one that comes up is like, well, why would God choose, of all people, why would he choose a woman who's engaged in prostitution? And it brings up some really interesting questions. Definitely questions about ethics and morality, right? Like, is it ever the right thing to do something which in general is a wrong thing to do? Like in this case, lying. It would seem that that's what the story is telling us, that there are times when it would be the right thing to do. It's certainly not a rule that's being made. It's certainly not to give us permission, but it is to tell us. It's along the lines of what Jesus said, if your ox or donkey falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, won't you pull it out? I mean, saving it from suffering is the priority. And so man was not created to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created to serve man and bless man. And so that gets into this whole thing of like, ethics, morality. It's a little bit difficult in this situation. I certainly have my view on like why what she did was the right thing to do, but it's a debate that people have thought about throughout history, especially when it came time for going door to door in World War II, during during the Holocaust. Do you have Jews in your house? What do you say? When you talk about like smuggling Bibles into places where they're not allowed to have the scriptures, what do you say when even today, like when terrible things are happening where people are going door to door? It's a really interesting ethical and moral question that's dealt with in that passage. But we're told explicitly in Hebrews chapter 11 that she acted in faith and that she acted righteously. And so, I think it's there's an interesting phrase that we sometimes say. We say that what we see through the Bible is that God draws straight lines with crooked sticks. We are those crooked sticks. We all have things in our lives that are to differing degrees. We've sinned in action, we've sinned in inaction. We have, it's not just what we've done, but it's even who we are at our core. And yet, God redeems us, he redeems our stories, and he transforms our lives and takes us from someone whose identity was sinner to someone whose identity is beloved child of God, a saint, a person who's being used by God to accomplish his work. So
Yeah, no, that is certainly a great story. And, we can just rejoice in the fact that God has chosen to embrace the Gentiles, the harlots, you just think the story. Jesus goes to, John chapter 4, it's a Samaritan woman, married 5 times, now living with the 6th, and he imparts to her the theology of worship. These are the type of people that God is looking to worship, and he's seeking, and it's the lost among us. It's the lost sheep of Israel, and the lost sheep of the world, and we just can rejoice in that.
Yeah, and it tells us that you can come to Jesus, you can come to the Lord now, no matter what you're doing. You don't have to clean yourself up before you come to him. You can come to him as you are and avail yourself to him. Now, Rahab didn't stay a prostitute. That's worth noting, right? It wasn't like saying, hey, Rahab, what you were doing was fine. Not at all. But it is saying that Rahab could come, and God engaged with her even in that time when she wasn't yet sanctified, but she was willing to follow. And so I think that says a lot, And I mean, if the only way to come to Jesus was to clean up your life, then all of us would be disqualified.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a great takeaway as we go, and hey, what do you think about what Rahab did? Was that righteous lying? Let us know in the comments. Write to us what you think. She's mentioned in that they call the chapter of faith, or the hall of faith in Hebrews, and so what was God doing there? What was God trying to teach us there? Well worth maybe reading about that, diving deeper into it, and let us know your thoughts. And we're going to continue through this genealogy. We're not done. We got a few more people to get to, and just kind of again the credentials of Jesus, who he is. The King of Israel, but also came as a king to rule the world. And so join us again as we continue in this Advent series. We continue through Matthew, and we look forward to seeing you again. God bless.